Welcome to the American History Channel. Subscribe and leave a like so you don't miss any of the upcoming videos like this one. Brenda Shadd, a descendant of the Choctaw and Cherokee nations, brought that heritage into the fashion world and became a showcase for a people almost always ignored. As she gained space on runways and in magazines, she showed that elegance is also about telling a story many tried to shove into the wings. She opened doors so other Indigenous women could be seen. Gertrude Three Finger, from the Cheyenne people, appears in William E. Irwin's work as part of a bigger project. From the late 19th century to the early 20th, he traveled through Indigenous villages recording faces, clothes, objects, and ceremonies, building an archive that today helps many people face the United States past with no filter and no makeup. In 1926, the Siksika elder Bear Bull looks into the camera with a steady calm. The braid over his forehead marks his position as the keeper of a sacred bundle tied to the medicine pipe tradition. He's not just a leader posing there, he's someone carrying in his own body the responsibility of keeping an ancient pact of the Blackfoot Nation alive. Long Wolf, an Oglala chief known as Shunkmanitou Hanska, dropped out of public conversation for decades. He died in 1892 in London while performing in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, far from the plains where he was born. When his name came back to the papers in 1997, many people realized that his life story also speaks of erasure, travel, and return. In 1901, Fred E. Miller photographs two Crow women on the Apsayaluke Reservation, Whistler and Hitz, the one who rides the gray horse. More than a neat pose, it's a slice of daily life. Clothes, posture, the way they look at the camera. For those who see it today, that moment holds the clash between following old customs and stepping into a century that promised to change everything. In the early 1900s, Iron White Man joined Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, traveling by train and caravan through dozens of cities in America. At each stop, he showed the audience how the Old West was turned into a spectacle, mixing indigenous traditions, arena tricks, and a living curiosity about that changing world. Under the sole of our boots, there's more than just mud. There's built-up memory. Every patch of ground holds the marks of those who walked before us and stays there, silent. When your hand touches the soil, you reach that invisible line between past and future and understand why taking care of the land also means taking care of the whole family, day after day. Long before science joined the conversation, Indigenous peoples already knew that a healthy dog couldn't always come from the same bloodline. To avoid problems, they traded puppies between villages, brought in animals from far away, and renewed their breeding stock. That's how they kept, for generations, an impressive variety of dog types in their camps. When he reached Fort Keogh in eastern Montana in 1880, the photographer L.A. Huffman captured two Sioux children, maybe siblings, standing quietly in a small studio. The setting was simple, but the way they look straight ahead makes us imagine the life they had outside that room and the paths still ahead of them. In 1953, at the height of her fame, Marilyn Monroe passed through Vancouver and ended up face-to-face with Chief Joe Mathias of the Capilano Band. While many people only saw a movie star, there was also an Indigenous leader there, firm in his own story. Their conversation brought worlds closer together and left a rare record of that intense period. In the 1880s, the Lakota chief Spotted Tail, or Sinta Gleska, lived under the pressure of negotiating with Washington without giving up the future of the Brûlé. Between visits from government agents and talks around the fire, he tried to secure land, game, and respect, keeping his people standing while white expansion took over the plains. In 1901, on an ordinary afternoon on the Fort Hall Reservation, a northern Shoshone family gets ready for a portrait that looks simple, but isn't. The calm faces show who's related to who takes care of whom. You can feel the weight of everyday life, of the land that feeds them, and of the memories they know they need to keep there. At the beginning of the 18th century, the Comanches left the mountains and moved into the Great Plains, learning step by step how to become masters of that land. Life on horseback became their school, their weapon, and their road. From Texas on, every trail, deal, and war helped build their reputation as a people who ruled the open country of the West. In the late 1920s, a northern Cheyenne woman appears leaning on a cane, steady, like someone who has seen a lot. The detailed scarf reveals hands used to patient work. Her direct look seems to recall nights of storytelling around the fire when the group's memory was as important as food or shelter. Around 1900, the face of an Oglala woman was captured with a calm that still stands out today. It's not just a beautiful or serious face, it's a sign of daily life on the plains, of kinship, of rituals repeated many times. When we meet that gaze, we see traces of a time when every gesture helped the people keep going. Coming from the Great Basin region in the American West, the Shoshone learned to live in constant motion. They left dry lands, followed hunting and trading trails, crossed mountains, until they reached what we now know as Idaho and Wyoming, carrying stories, prayers, and a way of life that recalls the old frontier days that many grandparents still talk about. Sometime in the 1930s, at a small train station, an Indigenous woman waits next to her son. The boy follows the tracks with his eyes. She holds the luggage tight, like someone carrying more than just clothes. No one there says their names. The scene, typical of those hard decades, only raises the old question every traveler asks: where did they come from, and where are they going? Between 1951 and 1963, Dan George led the Tsleil-Waututh Nation on the Pacific coast, trying to hold on to what was left of his people's land and culture. He wrote books and poems so he could be heard beyond the village, and already in his 60s, surprised people by going into film, bringing together his voice as a leader and as an actor, and leaving his story recorded on screen. In Northern California, Lucy Thompson grew up among rivers, fishing, and Yurok ceremonies. Instead of accepting that everything would be erased, she learned English, faced authorities, and put on paper the myths, rules, and memories of her people. Those pages became a kind of memory manual, helping Yurok generations know where they came from and who they still are. In Eufaula, Oklahoma, Tsianina Redfeather Blackstone of the Muskogee Nation was born. Over time, she realized her voice could go beyond singing on stage. She brought traditional songs to large audiences, spoke out against unjust laws and against racism, showing that being indigenous in the U.S. wasn't something from the past, but a living part of the present. For generations, the Bannock crossed southeastern Oregon and southern Idaho like someone reading a map by heart. They followed rivers, crossed valleys and deserts, knew where the game passed and where the roots grew. Each season became a survival lesson, a trading fair, and a guarantee that the people's stories would never be lost, even under pressure. In the early 20th century, the Seneca Awe-Ayu, called Pretty Flower, carries in her memory the path of her people. Back there, near Lake Ontario, they left villages, agreements, wars, and losses. Even far away, the way they speak, pray, cook, and raise their children keeps guiding who they are, what they value, and how they tell their story. In 1872, we see an Arapaho man posing with a serious face, but the image goes beyond his expression. There is a people who knew the plains from end to end, knew how to deal with enemies, hunts, and allies, and adjusted their lives to forced changes. To this day, researchers come back to this record to try to better understand those hard choices. In 1908, Roland Reed captures an Ojibwe man standing in a canoe in the middle of a quiet lake, blowing a handmade call to attract a moose. It's not just a hunt, it's training passed from father to son, a mix of technique, patience, faith, and respect for the forest. In a silence that seems to hold time for a whole moment, almost completely still. A 1906 portrait introduces us to someone from the Caddo Nation and, along with them, a piece of a world that is almost erased. This people built villages where Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas are today, took care of fields, streams, and rituals, negotiated and watched over intruders. Every detail of the clothing and the gaze reminds us that this ancient story still demands attention. In 1870, in the middle of a Shoshone village in Wyoming, the war chief's teepee worked like a kind of command room. That's where they discussed hunts, alliances, punishments, and the group's future. Meanwhile, the open landscape of the West was a reminder that every decision could determine everyone's survival, day after day, winter after winter. In 1898, Hachasnacha, known as Little Chief among the Arapaho, already carried in his body the story of many hard decisions. His name traveled across the plains as that of a man who tried to hold on to traditions while the white world tightened the noose, and every meeting could change the path of his people and of the generations to come. Explorers in the 17th century called this people Pima, but among themselves the name is Akimel O'odham, the river people. In the Sonoran Desert, each crop, canal, and ceremony kept the heritage of the old Hohokam alive, reminding everyone that without the flow of water, the memory of many generations could dry up along with the land and the villages there.